Welcome to Beyond Words by Pop Family. Today, I'm chatting again with Pop Senior Speech Pathologist and Clinical Lead for Language and Literacy, Monique. Monique is passionate about supporting families to access complex systems and funding schemes. Based in Adelaide, she began her clinical career by working in the mental health, disability and public health sectors before joining the Pop team to provide telehealth speech therapy all over Australia. Mon is really knowledgeable and explains things simply and beautifully for parents. I can't wait for you to hear what she has to say about how much speech therapy actually costs. Welcome back, Monique.
Thank you so much, Heidi. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. It was very easy. Let's chat broadly today about Aussie families wanting to purchase speech therapy. One of the most frequently asked questions that we get is, how much does therapy cost? I love that we're talking about this because really it is something that we are going to need to talk about over perhaps a few different episodes to really give parents an in-depth idea of how to best make these decisions together with their speech therapist. It's super complex. So I want to start by asking you, let's first talk about speech pathology in Australia in general. There are a lot of different speech therapy services out there, and I want to know how we pay for each of them. So I've actually written a list here, and I've got, if I'm a parent and I can access many different services in Australia, how about community health or my local hospital? How do I pay for that?
So that typically is covered by the government, and you generally are able to access a block of therapy, and the frequency and duration and kind of what span that will be over will be dependent on the community health setting and what they can offer.
Yeah, and what program they've got and what sort of staffing they've got. They might be understaffed. They might have a long wait list. Generally, community health and hospitals work together, and they have a category-based system. So basically, if you're a Cat 1, which means that something's potentially life-threatening, you need to be seen early. But if you're a Cat 2, which actually what a lot of children with speech and language disorders or delayed speech are, it means that if they're understaffed or it's going to be of a lesser priority than, for example, someone in the hospital who has just choked on something. So that's a little bit about hospital and community health.
Community health can also vary based on whether they do more work around parent training and upskilling, or whether they do more screening for the children, or whether they do some group therapy and some early intervention strategies. So that can also be vastly different across the different community health settings.
Absolutely. So there are different programs in different states around Australia. I have worked for New South Wales Health and Queensland Health, and I have worked in both adult and paediatric settings, and I have experienced different programs to do with their different fundings. There are a lot of really great resources and services out there. So if you're looking for speech therapy, it is worth calling up your local hospital or community health centre and seeing if you meet criteria for your community health service. There's criteria. It's not unlimited for everyone, of course. There's criteria. Okay, now let's go to schools, school-based speech therapy. How do we pay for that?
So that is also typically funded by the education department or the Catholic education department, depending if it's a private or a public school. Not every school has access to a speech pathologist, so it can vary state by state, school by school. But typically they tend to be funded to do screening or assessment-based, and then some consultation and strategies with teachers and supporting them to access the curriculum, rather than working one-to-one with your child.
Yeah, and it is different in each state. So we work across Australia, and you would have clients on your caseload right now who are in every different state in Australia, probably.
Yes.
Largely in Queensland, we're rather lucky to have Queensland Education funded speech pathologists. But like you said, sometimes that one speech pathologist has 200 children on their caseload. So they might see each child once a year for an assessment or a screener and give some classroom recommendations. There are some school-based speech pathologists in that public setting that have more funding for some reason. Obviously, I don't know how all the funding works, but they do get to do one-on-one intervention perhaps with your child, but it wouldn't be for the whole year. It would be for a short of block of time because they've got to move on to other children in that school. But most of and we work quite a lot with rural New South Wales schools, and New South Wales doesn't seem to have any state funding for schools that I don't know about metro areas because we don't work as much in metro areas, but they're rural schools. They don't tend to have a speech pathologist position like Queensland does. And other states I'm not so aware of either. So I think it must be a state-based thing.
I think it very much varies state by state, and also whether they can actually employ to those positions when they do come up.
Exactly. So then we're going to come up against the regional and metro changes. It's obviously a lot easier to employ a speech pathologist in a city than it is in the middle of nowhere. But you did say something about CathEd. So we know CathEd does pay for speech pathology services and has speech pathologists around Australia at their schools. And there are other schools. So even obviously schools have, I don't know, what I call buckets of money. You've got funding for something, you get to spend it on something. And some schools choose to spend their funding within their guidelines on speech pathology. So we actually partner with schools to either screen, assess or see their children long term. And the school is actually paying for that service for the parents. So parents could lobby for that, see if their school has a bucket. It's worth asking.
I think it's worth asking. You don't know if you don't ask.
Exactly. So during COVID, we had some small schools that had no ability to, Western schools, no ability to travel to spend their budget for school camp or something. So they actually chose to spend that on assessments for quite a few children, and especially those early intervention assessments from prep, kindy and prep through to grade 1. And so that is one example of how a school can use a different bucket of funding for a speech pathology service. All right, NDIS. We won't talk about it too much, but how do we pay for NDIS if I'm a parent?
So with NDIS, if you're eligible under their scheme, whether you're like under the age of 6 and you can access early intervention, or whether you're over the age of 9 and you're able to access for an ongoing disability diagnosis, it is all covered by the National Disability Insurance Scheme, and it can be reimbursed in multiple ways out of your child's NDIS plan.
And it's generally, it's always bulk billed, or can you pay a gap? Do people pay gaps for NDIS?
I don't believe so, because generally we are needing to meet their price guide, and so generally it's regulated across Australia.
I think on a technicality, if you're a speech pathology service, you could charge a gap for self-managed clients. Now, that is a nuance of the scheme. We don't at POP. I haven't heard of other clinics doing that, but with the fact that the NDIS haven't put the price up for years, I wonder if we will see that. But we haven't seen it. Generally, people charge the NDIS price guide. And so if you're a parent and you have NDIS funding, you're bulk billed. So that's your experience as a parent. Depending on how the admin happens, you generally are not out of pocket. Okay, non-for-profit. So I've got, there's a few wonderful non-for-profits out there. If you're in rural and remote Australia, you might be accessing a non-for-profit like Royal Far West, for example. How, as a parent, do I have to pay for that?
My understanding is no, it is covered, but again, it's quite limited in terms of what you're able to access and whether you're eligible, because how it can look can vary dependent on the different non-for-profits and what they provide. So it could be providing some general strategies, it could be some screening, it could be some parent coaching, it can really vary.
And so if you're accessing services through a non-for-profit, I think a lot of non-for-profits have moved their funding models to be charging NDIS packages as well, because non-for-profits were given more funding for this type of thing before the NDIS came in. So they then had to shift their business model and charge NDIS plans. But some non-for-profits are still funded by philanthropists and completely separate private philanthropists who are, for example, paying for the therapy for you or your child. So there are non-for-profit free bulk billed services. I don't think that you may receive a gap. I don't know all of them out there, but it's worth talking about them. All right. Now we're getting down to sort of a little bit more of the privately paid space. So Medicare, we've talked about this before.
Medicare is another big one. I mean, we know that our families who are eligible to access a chronic disease management plan or chronic condition management plan through their GP, they can access up to 5 sessions per year. And that doesn't cover the entire cost of the private appointment, but it can help remediate some of those costs and provide a rebate.
Yeah, so Medicare can provide a rebate, but you're paying a gap. So if I'm a parent, I'm paying a gap. I don't know. Some clinics, private clinics, I have seen in the past do a bulk billed screener, but it's going to be 20 or 30 minutes and it's got a cap of the Medicare length of sessions of 5 sessions. But that doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen. Private health insurance.
Well, private health insurance, it all depends on the policy that you have with your private health insurer. So it's worth checking to see what you're able to access. And again, it works the same way. Generally, they would cover like a portion of it, but you still would have a gap and to pay out-of-pocket expenses.
Yeah, and I think what you do to check that is you go and look at your extras or if you've got extras. Yes. I know that, I don't know if anyone else is with CBHS, but mine for speech therapy is so high. I don't access it for myself, but I'm often looking at that going, go with CBHS. It was like $1,800 or something. It was huge.
Now you're prompting me to go have a look at my own private health, just out of curiosity, see what my extras cover through Medibank.
I'm thinking of the meerkat. Compare the market. Simple. Okay, go and do that. And so if you're looking for the most amount of money off the services that you need, especially if it's speech pathology, comparing the market on private health could be worth it. Private health is expensive. You're going to be making those budgeting decisions for yourself. But if you've decided that it's something for your family, maybe checking out which one's best for speech therapy could be a good long-term plan for you. Last but not least, the parent. I'm a mom. I want to do speech therapy with you, Monique, and I've got to hand over my money. How generally am I doing that? And I think that's what this whole episode is about, really. But I think I'm paying, if I'm a parent, I'm answering this myself, but I'm paying either using one of the schemes we've already talked about.
Yeah. And if you do pay out of pocket, then it's generally charged through, your credit card or your bank transfer.
Yeah. And so that's going to be really largely, and when we talk about this is just generalized across Australia. If you're looking for speech therapy, this is what to expect and all of the different ways that you could access it or pay for speech therapy. Okay, great. So now that we've got a good idea of like how you would pay for speech therapy, how is it billed? So I was thinking about this coming in. To most people, it would make sense, I think, because a lot of services are billed the same. If I need a plumber to change my tap, he's going to bill me for my time, but he might also bill me for travel and he might bill me for like the utensils that he uses. So as a private speech pathology clinic, now we'll talk about private speech pathology practices like OP. How do we generally, or how do other private practices bill for our time?
So generally, obviously, there's billed time for the client service that you're providing in terms of direct face-to-face therapy. But then there's also additional parts that are, important in the quality care. So your reports, like assessment reports, progress reports, recommendations, which are generally essential for schools, doctors, NDIS, the family themselves. We've also got letters and home programs and resource packs. So our time is essentially billed in meetings, reports, providing all the additional services on top of the appointments that we provide to your child.
Yeah. And our administration per se is included in our hourly rate.
Correct.
So unlike a lawyer, for example, who bills every 8 minutes, or is it 8 minutes or 5 minutes for every time they write you an email, we would be, including that in the hourly rate that we are charging. So now let's talk about like the elephant in the room. What is the standard hourly rate for what am I going to pay? What am I out of pocket for speech therapy for an hour of speech pathology?
Well, across Australia, the standard rate for speech pathology services generally falls between $190 to $250 per hour, and that can depend on the service type, the location that it's in, the therapist's experience, that kind of thing can play into that. At POP, we align ourselves with the NDIS price guide, so our hourly rate for our NDIS clients is $193.99 per hour, and that's the same whether you're self-managed, plan-managed, agency-managed.
That's our NDIS rate. We actually have a slightly different rate for our privately paying families. The reason why we charge slightly less for our privately paying families is because they are paying completely out of their own pocket. And we do take that into account. NDIS families are paying for their service. They are being bulk billed for their service. And we find that that makes a difference. When the NDIS rate came out, we actually were charging quite a lot less than what they recommended. And over the years, we have, with inflation, have increased our privately paying price guide. It's now pretty much on par. It's very similar. But at other clinics, the same sort of thing happens. And at a different private practice, the cost, you talked about the lower end, about 190 an hour to 220, was it?
250.
250.
It tends to, yeah, on the upper end.
Upper end. And definitely, if you're paying for a psychologist these days, you're paying closer to 220 to 250 per hour. And so for health professionals, depending on who you are, that's just a rough guideline of an allied health professional, really. But it also depends on where you live and the cost of living where you are as to generally what the cost of your speech therapy session might be. So if you're living in a small town out west, you're not on the NDIS because you get charged that ludicrous rural fee that I
Correct.
don't like. We're not talking about that today. We don't charge that. We charge the same no matter where you live because it doesn't cost us any different. Our model of care, it costs us the same. So we charge you the same no matter where you live. But if you live in a rural town, you might have a slightly lower hourly rate because that clinic's rent might be lower. You know, things are going to be lower. If you are in the eastern suburbs in Sydney, you're going to be looking at a more expensive hour of therapy because renting that building is going to be super expensive. That's one of the things to keep in mind when you're paying for speech therapy. So I'm a parent. I'm on my journey. I've decided I want to pay for speech therapy. I still don't know how much it costs really, but I'm thinking, my friend, they sent their kid to the local community health centre for speech therapy. They did 10 sessions. They'll fix. Perfect. I'll be budgeting on 10 sessions. Won't I?
No. Short answer, no. Long answer is it's not really a reflection on how long it takes. It's a reflection on how long the service can actually be offered for that particular client. So the public health system, for example, which is what you were referring to, they do like a block therapy model. So essentially it allows therapists to see families for like short bursts, and really it focuses on, key skills, identification, screening before moving people off the caseload to make space for others. So the time frames could be 6 weeks, 10 weeks, 12 weeks, and it's more about trying to get equity across providing services to people across different regions to be able to access that block therapy. So generally, it's more about access and service flow, not really about how long it takes to reach those therapy goals when accessing those therapy blocks through the public health system.
Yeah, you've got a limit. We're so lucky in Australia to have a community health service that will see our children and provide them with support. I mean, hopefully if your community health service is staffed, I know of plenty, especially in remote Australia and regional Australia, that don't have staff, but if it's staffed, it's generally pretty great, but it's not the solution to everything, and it's certainly not the solution to optimal therapy outcomes. So it can be, and that's awesome. Like sometimes if that's exactly what your child needs, that length and that exact therapist at that time, then perfect. But I mean, I've worked in that setting for a few years, and I was lucky in my very first job to work within 3 different departments in the hospital, so I could refer to myself. So I just did more work so I could see my clients for a bit longer, my patients for a bit longer, sorry. But not everybody has that capability, and quite a lot of community health professionals have huge waiting lists, and they really have a lot of people to get through. So you have to move on and make space for somebody else, sometimes before you're ready.
And it's not to say that some kids won't make progress in that time. Like some children will be able to make progress in that time, especially if their goals like really narrow and they've got really strong family involvement. But for many others, many of the families that we see, 10 weeks is just the first step in a really longer therapy journey. It might get the ball rolling, help families learn some strategies or gather some data, but really it's done and dusted after 10 sessions.
Yeah. I would say on a very, very general, and this is where I'm general, this is not advice for you if you're a parent listening, but very generally at POP, we have, 90% pediatrics, so 90% kids and 10% adults that we see. And our 90% of kids are the largest cohort of them are school-age kids. And for what school-age kids, so that's 4 to 5 until 18, what they're coming to us for largely is by our data needs much more than 10 sessions. So by the time you're calling us and you have a school-age child, that 10 sessions might not do it. It might, depending on what they need, but we'll talk about that. I actually love data. I love the data that we can pull now as well to sort of prove this stuff. So let's talk about why it's so difficult for us. If I'm a parent, I'm listening to this podcast, I've clicked on it because I want to know the cost of therapy. And then I'm listening to us talk around it and all of these things. Like, that's so annoying. Why is it so difficult for us to predict the cost of therapy?
Well, no two children are the same. So every client comes with a different mix of strengths, challenges, motivation, attention span, home environment, support, and all of those things are factors that affect progress. So we might see two children, same age, with similar speech sound errors. One could master it in 10 weeks, whilst another one might take 12 plus months because they might have an underlying language difficulty or motor planning difficulty. And so therapy is not a one-size-fits-all formula at all. Part of our role is really a process of learning, generalizing, building independence, and that can really take different amounts of time for everyone.
Exactly. You imagine you've got 2 kids or 2 adults.
Even 2 adults, yep.
Let's make them have exactly the same diagnosis. Now, I want to talk about something that everyone sort of knows about, so dyslexia.
Mm-hmm.
It's a more longer-term one, so I can use a shorter-term one in the future to be less biased towards long-term therapy. But I've got 2 dyslexic kids. They're both 7. This one lives in the middle of the city, has full-time working parents, has no family support, is a really fussy eater, but has a tutor after school. This kid lives in the outback on a property. His mum does school with him. Grandma lives next door, collects his eggs for breakfast. He does gardening and eats spinach for dinner and doesn't complain about it. And, I'm going with 2 different, they've got exactly the same diagnosis, right? But the environments that these kids are in, and we talked about, it might be a good segue into support, because this child had a tutor, but this child has mum teaching him, which is a good or bad thing. But mum's highly motivated, and it could be 1-on-1 or 1-on-3, depending on how they're homeschooled, if they live in the middle of nowhere, like my sister. And grandma lives next door. So that is, that support is worth so much. Also, nutrition, like stuff that's not within our scope, that then affects the rate in which your child can grow and learn and develop. All sorts of things can affect how. And now I don't know, I didn't pick one to do better than the other, but we can make a rough guess, which is what the word prognosis means.
An educated guess.
An educated guess, that's better. We can make an educated guess. And we'll generally, when we've got a diagnosis like dyslexia, we can give a pretty accurate one.
Correct.
Because you need 6 months of intensive evidence-based intervention before you can even get a diagnosis. And intensive means at least weekly. So that we know that from the outset. Okay, if we're looking at this type of thing, we need to do weekly, probably for 45 minutes or 60 minutes. But we know what that looks like, and we know once we get the 6-month mark what we're looking for and which step to take after that. It's really lovely and clear because the diagnostic criteria is clear. There are other things, and I don't know, something maybe, for example, like a stuttering presentation, which everyone knows about stuttering generally as well, but there are other presentations like stuttering where you could have the two same kids and we would not be able to give as accurate a prognosis as we would with a kid like a dyslexic kid, where we know what the criteria generally tends to be.
Yeah, 100%. And I love that we talked about, family being a really big factor as well.
Yeah, family, and family being, so we're called pop family, but who is your family? So this kid over here had a tutor, and that would be part of their learning family and their
Yeah.
support system and environment, because that's a really enriching thing that child might need to implement their speech therapy. Is it a big sister? Is it, so what impact does that make, Mon? Like, and why do we need, I guess, community or family around us if we're going to make gains in speech therapy?
I actually think it's absolutely one of the biggest, because therapy, let's say you have a child, they're doing 45 minutes of therapy per week, right? So that's 45 minutes spent with a speech pathologist, but there are 10,000 minutes between sessions, right? If it's happening weekly, and even more when it's happening fortnightly. So what happens in those minutes is what truly drives progress. And so if we're seeing family, and again, we're saying family like your teachers, your grandparents, your people in your network, if they're helping the child to practice regularly, using strategies in everyday routines, keeping communication open and sharing those with the therapist, we do see faster, stronger results.
Absolutely. And I mean, I glorify family, but like, I'm a mum, and some things, like the amount of things that you have to do and I've only got 2 kids, when you've got a few kids is a lot. And so sometimes the best person to do that reinforcement might not be you. Sometimes it might be that tutor, or delegating and making sure. And so that's what our speech therapists are really good at. Like, who is the person? Let's identify them. Let's make sure we train them up, because you're exactly right. Therapy is going to cost less if you implement more practice or just absorb more outside of our sessions. We are essentially coaching and guiding you. We are not the ones doing all the heavy lifting.
We are the coaches. Yeah, we are the coaches.
And now we can move into my favorite analogy, which is speech therapy is just a gym workout for the brain. So you come to us, we work out which brain muscles need a workout, because that's what we're doing. When you're doing speech, and sometimes it's motor, but motor happens in your brain. Everything happens in your brain. We're working out which pathway, we're brain retraining. And so we're making that brain work. So we're the personal trainer or the coach making that brain work. But then we're also coaching you to make some lifestyle changes, or like, this is how you should practice. And so that family member or community member or teacher or tutor or big sister, grandma, that person who picks up that nuance, they actually learn to be the best therapist for your child. So then you've got not only your speech therapist, but you have another therapist. And the way that our telehealth model works actually almost forces that person to be more involved. It doesn't almost force, it does. That's why it's such a brilliant, it's a boundary, it's a barrier game where that person on the other end needs to do more because of the screen in the middle. And that means that they learn more about how to be a therapist. And that's a really beautiful way to gain better results and effectively get therapy to cost less. Because if you get more results more quickly, then it won't cost so much.
Yeah, in the long run, you won't be in therapy for as long.
Yeah. I mean, and what's the goal? Like, what is the goal of therapy? Because when we talk about, for example, that we've talked about the community health model, and their goal is largely based on budget. I mean, see people, but for this period of time, it's not really their goal, and get the greatest outcomes in that period of time, but it's not like optimal outcomes. That's not what the goal of that model is for. That is to see people who need to be seen, like I explained, in the category-based type system. What is our outcome? Like, if you come to therapy with us, what do we actually want to achieve with you?
I think we want to achieve your quality of life goals, which is what we do in collaboration, and we set those with the families. And so it looks so different from child to child, client to client.
But that's exactly right. What a parent is paying for at POP at the end of the day is for their child's life to get better. That seems like a big promise, but like that's actually what we do. That's what we're focusing on. So, you know, I always explain this to a speech pathologist or like someone new who starts a pop by saying, so if you do the self or you do an assessment and then you just create your activities based on that assessment task, that's just my worst nightmare, because that's not like, you're not being holistic. You're not actually, you know, that's what we want. We really want you to look at that whole person, that whole child, which is where it gets very difficult with prognosis, the whole child, the whole family. What are you actually here for? What's going to provide value to you as a person? And how do we make sure that you find value in what goals we're achieving? And then once we work that out, then we can go ahead and try and hit them in hopefully the shortest time possible.
Exactly, because if they're functional goals and they're meaningful to you, you're more likely going to be motivated to do the steps to support that goal, to do the home practice, to attend sessions regularly, to work closely with your speech pathologist. So, and they're all core parts of what can really affect client outcomes.
Absolutely. I mean, we're dipping into other topics now, but I mean, really, what we're talking about, functional, it's neuroaffirming. It's all of those things wrapped into one, but really, what we want is to provide value to the person who's paying for speech therapy, and we want to get outcomes that you want, not necessarily that we want. So we'll identify things and we'll go, oh, I think this one would be a good one, but we work with you. Okay, so prognosis is a big one. We talked about that, and it's a little bit of a how long is a piece of string situation. But we've then got how long the session is. So back to the PT, how long am I going to the gym for? You know, how long am I turning up to speech therapy for? And at POP, we have 30, 45 or 60-minute sessions. What factors are important to me as a parent to think about when I'm choosing that session time with my speech therapist?
Yeah, I think a lot of factors come into play. It really depends on the person, their age, their attention. So, for example, 30 minutes can work really beautifully for younger children, children with really poor attention, or where maybe the therapy focus is really narrow. You know, you're only focusing on a couple of speech sounds. 45-minute sessions are a nice sweet spot, I think, for like school-age clients, because it does give enough time for therapy, for coaching, and a quick chat. I think 60-minute sessions are really where the magic happens, where we can really delve into multiple areas and do more deeper coaching, as well as do our assessments and reviews with our families.
Yeah, you've just got that extra time to be a bit more well-rounded in a 1-hour session. 45 minutes is an average at POP. So if we're pulling our data, our average session length is 45 minutes. And that's why you say it's a sweet spot too. I think across an industry standard, like I interview hundreds of speech therapists, and I always ask them what sort of session length they're coming from. And an industry standard is that 45 to 50 minutes. So a lot of clinics don't offer 30 minutes. And
correct.
The reason why we have thought about cutting it out, but we just don't feel that aligns with our core value of being a holistic service, which means that there are some people that desperately need that shorter time period and wouldn't get value out of the longer one, especially people who might need more sessions. So, for example, 2 sessions a week, and there are some conditions that really need intensity, so they need more sessions per week. And we feel strongly that the 30-minute, that it's cheaper and shorter, but it's really needed for those. But on average, people do 45 to 60 minutes.
Yeah, 45 to 60 minutes, I would say, is probably what I see the most.
Let's talk about frequency, because I've just talked about that. Oh gosh, what am I using the same word here? I've got to make sure I'm using the same word. We've just talked about length, session length.
Yeah.
How long duration. Duration. There we go. That's my word. Duration. And then what are we going to call the next one? Frequency. So how often?
Frequency. Yeah. So how
Every
often?
Week. Yeah. How often? So I'm coming for 45 minutes because that's average. We've chosen 45 minutes for my child, but how often do they come? Once a month or 3 times a week?
So generally can be, well, it really depends on the client and their goals. I think weekly sessions are really ideal for like building momentum, especially when a child is learning something new, like a speech sound or decoding strategy. Fortnightly works when we're more in the consolidation phase. So families are feeling more confident with home practice and need just a bit more kind of top-up support and guidance. Monthly is better for more your long-term monitoring and maintenance for those people who are more at the end of their therapy journey. So we will adjust as we go, but weekly I would say is best to start with for optimal outcomes.
And I find as a clinician, you know, throughout my whole career, when I had a fortnightly client, the accountability would really drop off. And unfortunately, that's on both ends. Like as a speech therapist, if you don't see someone for 2 weeks, you then go, oh, you haven't been forced to think about them like often enough. And so I then struggle to remember what I was doing with them. I have to spend more time planning. It's been so long since I've seen them that I may see different changes. So it actually makes it harder for me as a therapist to see that frequency. And I never really enjoyed that because weekly, I know what I did last week. You've got to see me this week. So pressure's on for you to sort of do a home practice or to be, I'm going to ask you, how did you go with that? So and that 1 week, it just seemed to be like, you know, it is the sweet spot. There is research behind it as well. But 1 month, for example, we've got some people who would do monthly therapy, but it's very small. And sometimes we actually say, no, we won't do monthly therapy. We don't, if it's particularly, like we wouldn't take someone's money if we didn't think it was going to get the optimal outcomes for that person. Just because it fitted the budget or something, we'd rather use them we'd rather optimize a budget for the optimal outcomes, and it might not be the right frequency. There are some clients, some people, especially I'm thinking like a late talker where mum's going away and doing heaps of homework, where it could be appropriate on occasion.
Yeah, I think it's really just working closely with your therapist around it's all really around balancing that clinical need, but also family capacity. And really, when you think about it from the, perspective of the child and the family, I think starting weekly, even if you do have the idea you need to drop to fortnightly, is always great because then you can build rapport with your therapist, your child, and the family starts to build trust with their therapist. And that's where we really see some wonderful progress happening.
Relationships are where the magic happens. Engagement, that's where the magic happens.
Where are we going next? Where are you taking me next on this journey of
we've
therapy?
Talked about we're on the roller coaster.
We're on the bus. We're in the bus.
We are the pop bus. We're on the bus. We're in our seats, but we're taking the parents on this ride with us, and we're going. Okay, so now I've saddled up. I've gone right. I might do 45 minutes. We might start with weekly because that is generally what Pop's going to recommend. You come to us with a diagnosis of CAS, which is childhood apraxia of speech.
Correct.
I was like, what are the long
what is
words?
That acronym?
Baby brain. But if you come to us with a diagnosis that we really clearly know needs higher frequency, we would say, what's in your budget? Do you have 2 or 3 times a week? Because the evidence says that's best for you.
Yes.
So there are specific diagnoses where we know higher frequency works better. And then there are other diagnoses like a language disorder, for example, where the evidence says that maybe doing it 3 times a week is no better than weekly, which is why largely as a company we land on a standard of weekly sessions in the beginning at least. And that's our general recommendation. We've landed on 45. I'm the mum. I've always landed on 45. We're looking at starting weekly. I want to know how neuroplasticity maybe plays into this. Like the law of neuroplasticity, does that back up any of what we're saying in terms of frequency and duration?
Oh, 100%, because it's like one of the principles is if you don't use it, you lose it. And so if we're not practicing outside of sessions or we're not seeing each other very frequently, then we're not really using those skills. We're not training those muscles, and then we're not building and we're not growing and we're not developing. And that can really make then progress slower.
Yeah. And so if you're not familiar with the laws of neuroplasticity. Go and have a look. It's like just brain firing and wiring. And what we're doing in speech therapy quite a lot of the time is actually building new pathways in the brain. So we do need repetition. We need reps. So that's why I get back to the gym. We need reps. I'm not going to get strong arms if I don't do the actual action, which is what we do in our brains. We need repetitions of those activities in order to build those strong neural pathways, which is just building a new road in your brain so that you can do stuff better.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like the electrical signals from your brain can like jump to that skill faster and actually be able to do it because of that repetition, that ongoing, consistent practice of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If you've ever mastered a skill in your life, if you're a parent listening to this, think about something that you're good at. Were you born good at it? You know, like for me, horse riding.
Mm-hmm.
Did I come out of the womb a good horse rider? No. I spent hours and hours and hours and hours and half of my life as a child in the saddle of a horse. So, I mean, that's how you get good at it. You fall off plenty of times, but you practice and practice and practice and practice and flex those muscles, and then all of a sudden you get better at it and you get generalization. But you know what? I haven't done horse riding in a few years, so it's a good analogy for, wow, I might need a refresher. My muscles might have lost a bit of muscle memory.
But then you might find that it won't take you so long to get back to where you were because it is because of the laws of neuroplasticity.
Of course. So my body does what it's supposed to do when I get on a horse, but it's my confidence. So I go, okay, yep, I can do this. And maybe a better example is for adults like snow skiing or something. A lot of people have been snow skiing like once or twice in their life.
Yeah.
And so you go and you do it once and you get good at it over a week because you do it every day and you do it all the time. But then if you don't go for, a year, like how good are you really at snow skiing? So it's the same premise, and that's what we're talking about when we talk about neuroplasticity. Now we're going to circle back to length, like total duration, because I'm a parent and I'm pushing for I am a type A parent and I'm putting my annual budget together and I want to know if I can afford to go on holidays if I choose to do speech therapy. So we've chosen 45 minutes. We're going to do coming for weekly. Say my child does have a diagnosis of dyslexia. How long am I doing therapy for? Is it the 10 sessions? Is it 2 months, 12 months? 14 months, 4 years? Like, how do we know? And when do we know?
Oh, it's the $1 million question. And again, it really depends on the goal. So I guess let's take a look at a few examples, right? So for some speech sound goals, let's say they've got some typical speech error patterns. There's maybe 1 or 2 speech errors that they need to work on. They may need to take 3 to 6 months of consistent therapy to reach that kind of clear functional speech. But then we look at literacy and we look at dyslexia. The evidence tells us that we need at least 6 months of structured intervention work before the diagnosis can be made. And then post that diagnosis, the likelihood of your child needing therapy past, 12 months, 24 months is higher.
Yeah, definitely higher. And
yes,
I've spent the last decade working with dyslexic kids and adults, and it is so amazingly rewarding. You work in this area too. And there is arguably no more functional skill than literacy. Being able to read and write, walking that path with people who have not been able to do that is just, it's shocking because it's something that I find so easy. So it's very humbling and great work, but the long-term success that you can see, and then when you get someone to the point, especially a dyslexic child, and I'm going to be careful not to talk about outcomes here or specific examples, but because I'm not allowed to, but when you work with someone long-term and you can get, especially someone with a dyslexia diagnosis, you can get them to a point where you've achieved a lot of wonderful goals, but what you then need to do, especially for a child who's developing, is you need to maintain that. So a dyslexic child is 7 and you're trying to teach them how to read because they can't read yet and their peers can. So they're down here and their peers are up here. And then over the next 2 or 3 years, you might get them to here. And then all of a sudden, you know, they're getting a C in English. Yeah. And their peers are, you know, I mean, a C, like that's awesome. I mean, we're not training rocket scientists here. We will probably this dyslexic kid is a rocket scientist, but it's just reading. So we're getting to that point where, but then if we drop off there, what could happen is the gap could get larger before the end of school. So we've got to make sure that we then, and that's where you were saying like the monthlies, or there are different bespoke term by term therapies, or where children can leave therapy and come back for a refresher when they need a new neural pathway to be built and they've got a skill that's difficult. Because when you get to high school, for example, there are a lot of tools that you're allowed to introduce. Kids can use computers more, and and dyslexic kids can find things easier because they don't have to actually just do the pen and paper all the time. So and depending on your school, depending on the rules, depending on all of those things, depends on what you might need throughout each different stage and how long-term that is. But with the dyslexia example, I have seen professional adults with dyslexia who come back to relearn and to make their jobs easier, or to help get a promotion because they need a bit of a upskilling. And it's a wonderful thing to be able to provide, but it's quite long-term compared to if we're going to fix the sound.
Exactly. And I think, you know, the key messaging really here is that the goals evolve as the child grows. And this is why therapy, they don't stay the same. And the therapy needs to remain purposeful, but it also needs to be reviewed really regularly, because sometimes, you know, the goal is not age appropriate. Sometimes the goal may be to just try and reduce that widening of that gap between where your child is and what is expected of them at school in that level.
And quite a lot of time, what doing that does, like, I don't care about their results at school. I want to be very clear to parents, and sorry to teachers listening, but like, I don't care. It's so subjective, and what are we testing them on anyway? Subject matter. I mean,
correct.
So it's one way of learning, and there's so many other different ways that our brains work that we could be testing these kids on, but they're not getting tested on. So, you know, if it's that reading element and it's English class, doing this and closing that gap a bit, what that does is it builds confidence. And it builds that confidence so that when that child can leave school, when that child is 17 and they're choosing with, you know, they're looking at the, you know, careers advice with their mum or dad or their teacher, that they don't feel limited by what their basic skills are. Like that's my quality of life dream, optimal outcomes for this hypothetical dyslexic child that we're talking about. So, I mean, if they're privately paying, they could have spent thousands and thousands of dollars and been in therapy forever, and that would be forever, not forever, but from diagnosis to the point where they have the confidence to choose what they truly want in life, and they aren't restricted by that literacy difficulty.
Yeah, by that reading difficulty or that spelling difficulty, 100%.
We're back to how long's a piece of string, but I hope that we've explained that really well to parents.
I think so.
Let's just circle back to family support. If I've got all of these things going for me, and do you know what I like to do with parents? And speech therapists should probably do this too, is I like to say, hypothetically, and I use Oprah because Oprah is like this really big positive energy. You get a car, you know? So if I was Oprah, like I like to do this with a family. If I was Oprah, or if you were Oprah, this is what I'd tell you need. So it means if there was no financial barrier as a speech pathologist, what would I recommend? And that's an interesting exercise because you're generally not going to go there. Sometimes you can though. And so you shouldn't make the assumption that the parent is not going to prioritize that, especially if they're paying for it out of pocket. You have no idea what their finances are. They might go, we could do that. Or I've worked with families who I have replaced the English curriculum for their child. And I've worked with their teacher and I have become that class in school. They've done my homework. And so I've become quite a big part of their either homeschooling or worked in with their traditional school. And that's a really big help to the teacher to help with that individualized learning plan. And it was a huge investment in, you know, that particular child's confidence to be able to structure it that way. So you just never know. And I think it's really important to throw the Oprah scenario out there, because you can always pare it back and move backwards to what you can afford. So we've talked about so many factors today that influence the cost of speech therapy, essentially. Arguably the biggest one is your budget. Like, we didn't even talk about that, but like, what is your budget? Are you Oprah? You know, you could be. That's great for you. But you need to talk with your speech therapist about what you've got to work with. NDIS is really clear on this. Like, this is the budget. This is what you've got to work with. And so then you can make the best plan for how to best get those quality of life outcomes and how to best gain that confidence for you or your child. Next, I think, is prognosis. It's come up in every question that I've asked you today.
Yeah, because it's a big driver of cost.
And so can you just summarize prognosis for parents, like to make it really easy?
I guess prognosis is really just the likely pathway of how much improvement we expect and, you know, the journey it takes to get there and how long it might take to get there. And we've talked about how it's influenced by lots of different factors, and it's not about predicting it perfectly. It's about setting, you know, realistic expectations and tailoring therapy so that it's really meaningful.
And something we didn't talk about to do with prognosis is that there are checkpoints along the way that can really, really help with budgeting and prognosis. So at the beginning, I'm the parent. I've come, so at POP, we do a discovery call. So I've called up, I've talked to a speech therapist for 15 minutes. She's told me she thinks my child needs speech therapy. So then I book in, I meet my speech therapist. Hi, Monique, I'm meeting you. We do an initial consultation and then an assessment. Now, depending on whether I've already had assessment somewhere else and I'm bringing that to you, or I've had no assessment, or I'd like not to do assessment, you don't have to do standardized assessment at POP.
Correct.
You don't have to purchase a report. We can do what we call a dynamic assessment, which means we can just get started and see where you're at. So, but that is still an assessment phase. That's a getting to know you phase, getting to know what our goals are. So I would just really broadly, roughly for parents say that that phase takes anywhere from 3 to 6 sessions.
Yes.
Right.
That's where we really see a solid kind of sense of what's driving the difficulty and how responsive the child is to the therapy.
Or as an adult, if you're an adult, it might take less, because you're able to communicate for yourself. You're able to tell us your budget, like all of those things. But if you're bringing your child, it might be 3 to 6 sessions. So if you're thinking like initial outlay, pay for the 3 to 6 sessions, then there's a checkpoint and you can sort of say to your therapist, okay, like you've got a fair idea of what the picture looks like now. How long until we sort of reach this benchmark or this goal? And we've got short-term goals, which is like 3 to 6 months. We've got long-term goals, which is like 12 months. But then we've got quality of life goals. We could hit some of those within that 12 months. We don't know. We could need to reach for longer. But at that point, your therapist has a better idea, and they are probably going to be able to stretch you out to what they think the next checkpoint is from there. And so I think that that's maybe an important one for budgeting, is to say to your therapist, hey, is this a checkpoint where we can talk about how long this next bit's going to take? And they should know.
Yeah, I think it's really just a point of trying to figure out, like, you know, what we know at this point in time and what we kind of could predict could happen over different parts, whether that's termly or whether that's 6 monthly. You know, it can vary per child and what kind of goals that we're trying to achieve with them.
And what I like to say to parents is, okay, so if we haven't achieved this by this time, this is probably going to be my plan.
Yes.
But if we have achieved it, this is going to be my plan. And then the final piece of the puzzle is, and one of the main predictors is how much you practice.
Yes.
We're back here, neuroplasticity. So if we're going to wrap up on this episode, how much does therapy cost? It's largely impacted by how much work you do, I guess.
Yeah, it's the 10,000 minutes between sessions and how you choose to spend those, and being able to do as much home practice and even just embedding some of the strategies into everyday routines. That's home practice in itself.
Yeah, incredible. Thank you so much, Monique. I think that this episode is going to be highly valuable for parents. No pun intended. Actually, no pun intended. But hopefully, I'm not sure if we even need to do one. We had examples in here today as well. I was thinking we might need another episode for examples, but we will see. It's just such a complex discussion, but hopefully this gives parents a really good place to start and a springboard to have a really meaningful, winning conversation with their therapist about how much that achieving those quality of life goals is going to cost for them.
Yeah, and really just hopefully we also empower parents to really build those partnerships with the therapist and talk it through.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Don't forget to head over to the show notes to get your free snapshot of what affects the cost of speech therapy, plus follow for more episodes. I really wish that we could have given you a set framework or price guide to answer this big budget question. However, hopefully we explain just how complex and individualized the ongoing costs of speech therapy can be and can vary from person to person. If you have any questions about how much speech therapy costs, you can always book in with a Pop Speechy for a free discovery call. We'd love to hear what other topics you'd like us to cover. You can reach me by leaving a comment on our podcast app or sending us a DM on Instagram or Facebook. Our handle is @BeyondWordsByPopFamily. That's all one word. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands in which we are joining this meeting from today. As we connect virtually, we recognise that we gather from many different places across Australia, each with its own unique history, culture and connection to country. We pay our respects to elders past and present. Please also remember, if you or your child are facing challenges in the areas we discussed today, please seek an individualised speech pathology assessment or chat to your GP. This is not medical advice. Take care, and we'll catch you in the next episode.